For years, Phil Mickelson was impossible to ignore. Whether people agreed with him or couldn't stand him, they talked about him. Every interview became a headline. Every opinion sparked a debate. Every move seemed to divide the golf world a little further. Then something unusual happened. The debate never disappeared, but somehow the conversation around Phil did. So, how did golf arrive at a point where one of the most influential and controversial players of his generation became the one person nobody seemed interested in talking about? And more importantly, why is that suddenly starting to change? Because over the last few years, something has happened that the PGA Tour would probably rather avoid. The further golf moved forward, the harder it became to ignore some of the warnings, criticisms, and predictions that once made Phil Mickelson one of the most divisive figures in the sport. Now, to be clear, this isn't a story about whether Phil was a hero or a villain, but here's the part nobody seems able to explain. If Phil was so wrong, why do some of the things he warned about look strangely familiar today? Before we go any further, I want a quick answer from you. Were you on Phil's side during all of this, or against him? Drop a comment below. By the end of this video, you might change your mind. If Phil Mickelson had spent his entire career fighting from the outside, this story would be easy to explain. But that's not what happened. Phil wasn't some overlooked player taking shots at the establishment. He was the establishment. For decades, he was one of the most recognizable faces in golf. Fans showed up to watch him. Broadcasters built coverage around him. Tournament organizers knew that when Phil was in the field, attention followed. More importantly, he understood how the sport worked at the highest level because he had lived inside that world longer than most players ever will. That's what made his position so unusual. When someone with no influence criticizes a system, the criticism is easy to dismiss. People assume they're frustrated, unsuccessful, or looking for attention. Phil didn't fit any of those categories. He had the trophies, the victories, the respect of his peers. Whether people agreed with him or not, nobody could honestly claim he didn't know what he was talking about. And that's why the reaction to him became so intense. Because the moment Phil started questioning certain parts of professional golf, the discussion stopped being about one player's opinion. Suddenly, it became a debate about the sport itself. Fans picked sides, players picked sides, media outlets picked sides. Almost overnight, golf found itself arguing over questions it had spent years avoiding. And that's exactly why what happened next mattered so much. Because when an average golfer speaks, the sport moves on. When Phil Mickelson speaks, the entire golf world reacts. And one decision would change the conversation around him forever. That decision didn't happen quietly, in fact. It triggered one of the biggest fractures professional golf had seen in decades. Up until that point, Phil had been viewed through a relatively familiar lens. He was talented, successful, occasionally controversial, but still very much part of the world that helped make him famous. Then he stepped into a fight that was much bigger than any tournament. Suddenly, conversations that used to revolve around scorecards and trophies started revolving around power, influence, money, and control. For the first time in years, golf wasn't arguing about who was winning. It was arguing about how the entire sport should operate. And right in the center of that argument was Phil Mickelson. The reaction was immediate. Some people viewed him as someone willing to say things others were afraid to say publicly. Others saw him as a player creating unnecessary division inside a sport that had spent decades building a particular image. What made the situation so explosive wasn't simply that people disagreed with him. Golf has always had disagreements. The difference was that this time the disagreement touched the foundation of the sport itself. Questions that once lived behind closed doors were now being debated in public. Fans took sides. Commentators took sides. Even players who preferred staying out of controversy found themselves being asked where they stood. And as the debate grew louder, something else started happening. The focus slowly shifted away from the actual arguments and toward Phil himself. His motives were questioned. His decisions were questioned. His legacy was questioned. For a while, it felt as though every discussion in golf somehow found its way back to him. And this is where the timeline starts getting interesting. But that's not what happened here. The arguments continued, the debates never fully disappeared. Many of the same issues that once divided the sport remained part of the discussion. Yet somehow, the person who helped bring those issues into the spotlight seemed to drift further and further into the background. Not completely invisible, not forgotten, just quieter. Phil had spent years becoming one of the most polarizing figures in golf. By that point, most people had already decided what they thought about him. Depending on who you asked, the answer changed. What rarely changed was the certainty. People felt confident they already knew the story, and when people think they've already reached a conclusion, they often stop asking questions. That's why this period matters, because while attention around Phil gradually cooled, something else was happening in the background. The issues that once made him so controversial weren't disappearing. If anything, some of them were becoming more relevant. The assumption was simple. The sport would move forward. The existing structure would remain intact, and the discussion would eventually fade away. For a while, that appeared to be exactly what happened. Then something interesting occurred. Changes began appearing across professional golf that looked surprisingly different from the environment people had been defending only a few years earlier. Not identical to what Phil had argued for, not a complete reversal, but different enough that people started asking questions they hadn't been asking before. Suddenly, conversations about player influence, player leverage, and the future direction of professional golf were no longer being treated as impossible ideas. They were being discussed seriously. Ideas that once sounded controversial were now part of mainstream golf discussions, and once that happened, some observers started looking back, not at the headlines, not at the arguments, but at the assumptions people were making at the time. Because if one assumption turned out to be less certain than everyone believed, what about the others? Because the first shift could always be explained away. Sports evolve. Organizations adapt. New ideas appear all the time. One example doesn't necessarily mean much, but what caught people's attention was what happened next. The discussions that once seemed temporary didn't disappear after a season or two. In many cases, they became even more central to the future of professional golf. Questions about who holds influence, questions about how decisions are made, questions about whether players should have a greater voice in shaping the direction of the sport. Those conversations kept resurfacing again and again, and that's where some observers started revisiting the past with a different perspective. Not because they suddenly agreed with everything Phil had said. Most didn't. But because they realized something important. The easiest way to dismiss an argument is to assume it becomes irrelevant over time. The problem comes when time refuses to make it irrelevant. That's what was happening here. The further golf moved away from the original controversy, the more certain topics seemed determined to follow it. What once looked like a single disagreement increasingly resembled the beginning of a larger conversation that the sport was still trying to navigate. And that's when the narrative started becoming more complicated, because critics could still argue that Phil had been wrong about many things. Supporters could argue that he'd been right about others. Both sides had evidence, both sides had arguments, and both sides were becoming harder to ignore. 2 examples can still be debated. 3 is where people start stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and that's exactly what began happening, because by this point, the discussion was no longer centered on any single comment Phil had made years earlier. It was centered on a much more uncomfortable possibility. What if the story people thought was finished had never actually ended? The further professional golf moved from the original controversy, the more difficult it became to treat that period as a closed chapter. Not because every prediction came true, not because every criticism proved correct, but because enough of the underlying questions remained alive. The conversations were still happening, the disagreements were still happening, and perhaps most importantly, the sport was still searching for answers to many of the same issues that once made Phil such a polarizing figure. That's when a subtle shift started taking place. People stopped asking, was Phil right? And started asking, was the reaction to Phil too simple? And once that shift occurs, something else happens. The spotlight gradually moves away from the individual and toward the system around him. Because if one of the sport's most controversial figures was raising questions that continue echoing years later, then the real story may not be about Phil at all. It may be about why those questions still haven't gone away. And that's where this stops being a story about one golfer. Because what comes next is the part that creates a genuine problem for the PGA Tour. Because this is where the story flips upside down. For years, the easiest way to view this entire saga was through the lens of personalities. Phil said this. Someone else disagreed. Fans argued. The sport moved forward. Simple. But the longer the debate continued, the harder that explanation became to maintain. Because personalities eventually fade from the spotlight. Questions don't. And that's where the PGA Tour finds itself facing a challenge that has nothing to do with one player. The challenge is that many of the discussions that once seemed tied exclusively to Phil Mickelson now exist independently of him. They've become larger than the person who helped bring attention to them. That's important, because organizations generally prefer criticism they can attach to an individual. It's easier to respond to a person. It's much harder to respond to an idea that continues resurfacing regardless of who is talking about it. And that's exactly what has happened. The debate evolved. The conversation expanded, new voices entered it, different perspectives emerged, yet many of the underlying questions remained remarkably familiar. Questions about influence, questions about direction, questions about who ultimately shapes the future of professional golf. The PGA Tour doesn't have a problem because Phil Mickelson still exists in the conversation. The PGA Tour has a problem because the conversation survived without him. That's a completely different situation because once an argument becomes bigger than the person who started it, dismissing the individual no longer resolves the issue. And whether people agree with Phil or not, that's the reality the sport now faces. Which brings us to the most interesting part of this entire story. The silence around Phil didn't break because he suddenly returned and demanded attention. It broke because more and more people started looking back and realizing that the story they thought had ended was still unfolding. And that's when the conversation changed once again. And that's why the silence eventually started breaking. Not all at once, not through a single interview, not because Phil suddenly stepped back into the spotlight and demanded to be heard. In many ways, the opposite happened. The conversation returned on its own. Little by little, more people began looking back at that period with fresh eyes. Not necessarily more sympathetic eyes, just more curious ones. The certainty that once defined the debate started fading. Questions replaced conclusions. Nuance replaced certainty. And that's when the discussion became interesting again, because once people stop asking whether someone was completely right or completely wrong, they start examining what actually happened. That's exactly where the golf world seems to find itself today. The focus is no longer entirely on Phil Mickelson. It's on the ideas, concerns, and disagreements that outlived the controversy itself. Some people still believe he damaged the sport. Others believe he forced the sport to confront realities it had ignored for too long. Neither side has disappeared. If anything, both sides seem more convinced than ever. But the important thing is that the conversation is happening again. Not because history changed. Not because new facts suddenly appeared. But because enough time passed for people to separate the emotion of the moment from the questions underneath it, and once that happened, the silence was never going to last forever, which leaves one final question, and it's the question that makes this entire story so difficult to answer, because maybe that's the real reason this story refuses to go away. Not because everyone suddenly agrees with Phil Mickelson, and not because everyone suddenly disagrees with the PGA Tour, but because the further we get from the original controversy, the harder it becomes to view the entire situation in simple terms. Maybe Phil was wrong about some things, maybe he was right about others, and maybe the biggest mistake was believing the story was ever as straightforward as people wanted it to be. So here's my question for you. When you look back at everything that's happened, do you think Phil Mickelson was ultimately bad for professional golf? Or do you think he forced the sport to confront questions it didn't want to face? Drop your verdict in the comments below. And while you're there, tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these videos reach. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more golf stories where the facts are clear but the truth is still debated. Subscribe to the channel, because the next conversation the golf world can't seem to agree on is already starting.